Jackson Blake had never liked silence, yet lately it seemed to follow him like a shadow. It echoed off the concrete walls of the empty pool in his backyard, a massive blue shell of stagnant water and forgotten cannonballs. The days of laughter and splashes were long gone. The kids had grown. His wife had moved to New York for a new start, and the house was now too large for the quiet that haunted it. It was a Tuesday morning when Jackson finally made the call to have the pool removed. The contractor, a straight-talking guy named Edgar, gave him a fair quote and said the paperwork was no issue, just a few permits, safety checks, and a 3-week removal plan. Jackson nodded. He wanted to reclaim the space, maybe put in a fire pit, or just plant native grasses. Something simple, something that didn't echo the past. But the very next morning, as the excavator rumbled up the street and the first scoop of dirt was carved out, the screech of brakes and the snap of heels on concrete broke the air. A woman stood at the curb, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she was about to spit venom. Karen Delaney, president of the Ridgeview Estates Homeowners Association, and self-appointed guardian of the community's charm. Oh, she didn't need a crown. The smugness alone was royalty. She strutted up the driveway like she owned the place. "Excuse me?" she barked. "This is an unapproved alteration to the communal aesthetic. You are in violation of HOA Regulation 14B. Jackson didn't flinch. "I submitted permits. Got city approval. It's my property." Karen smiled, tight, thin, sharp. "Your property is part of our shared vision. Removing a pool affects the neighborhood's value. You should have waited for board approval before Jackson could respond." She shoved a folded letter into his hand. In big, bold letters at the top, cease and desist, citing something about pending review, environmental disruption, and a requirement for HOA consultation on landscape altering decisions. The contractor looked at Jackson, shrugged, and turned off his engine. Jackson read the letter again, slower this time. It was written like a legal notice, but no signatures, just Karen's initials and a reference to an obscure section of the HOA handbook he hadn't read since moving in. He looked up. "This isn't legal," he said quietly. Karen's grin widened. "It doesn't have to be. It's HOA enforceable." She pivoted and walked away, clipboard tapping against her side like a sword sheath. Victorious in her interruption, Jackson stood there, the sun baking his shoulders, the empty pool gaping behind him like an open mouth. Something in his chest twisted, not just annoyance, but something sharper. This wasn't just about a pool. Karen had drawn a line, okay? And Jackson realized she was ready to fight for control. He looked at the torn-up dirt, the paused machine, and the letter in his hand. No, this wasn't over. It had just begun. It started subtly, like a slow leak from a hidden pipe. One day, after Karen's dramatic cease and desist stunt, Jackson noticed a man with a camera walking slowly past his house. He paused near the backyard fence, tilted the lens upward, and took 2 quick shots before disappearing into the sidewalk. Shuffle. Then came the letters. The first violation notice was laughable. Visible trash can during non-collection hours, $25. Jackson had forgotten to wheel it back behind the side gate. Annoying, but harmless. The second one landed 2 days later. Inconsistent lawn height, $50. Jackson had mowed the front yard, but the backyard had been torn up for the pool project. That was apparently unacceptable. The third violation arrived on Friday, improper exterior color shade on back shed. That one truly puzzled him. The shed hadn't been painted in years. Every envelope had the same crisp, official HOA watermark. Every fine seemed more arbitrary than the last. Every notice had Karen's name stamped at the bottom. It wasn't just paperwork either. At the local cafe where Jackson grabbed his morning coffee, a couple of neighborhood moms were whispering near the pastry counter, glancing sideways at him. He heard the words standing water, mosquitoes, and blight drifting through the air as if his backyard had turned into a swamp overnight. That afternoon, a neighbor he barely knew Glenn from 3 houses down ambled over while Jackson was collecting mail. "Hey, man," Glenn said casually, "just between us, Karen's saying your property might tank our home values. You sure that pool thing's worth it?" Jackson gave him a cold stare. "It's a personal decision on private property, Glenn, but thanks for your concern." Glenn nodded and backed away, but not before saying something that stuck with Jackson. "You know, she ran 3 other folks off this street. Just be careful." That night, Jackson stood at the kitchen window, looking out over the yard. The pool remained in limbo, half-drained, surrounded by equipment that had fallen silent. Under HOA pressure, the craters around it were beginning to harden into dusty pits, and weeds were creeping in along the edges. He hated the look of it, hated what it represented. Not failure, but intrusion. Someone else dictating what he could or couldn't? At around 11:30, just as he was locking up the back door, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He ducked the lights and squinted into the darkness. There, at the edge of the fence, someone was standing. Silhouette. He grabbed his phone and zoomed in through the window. A woman in a windbreaker hooed up, holding a phone. Her flash blinked. Twice. Snap. Snap. She was taking pictures of the backyard again. "Karen," he whispered. Without turning on the porch light, Jackson crept to the side gate and listened. The footsteps were quick, quiet, retreating. By the time he opened the gate and looked down the street, all he could see were taillights rounding the bend. He walked back to the crater, bare feet pressing into the loose dirt. The half-empty pool reflected a sliver of moonlight, stared into it, as if it might answer him. She wasn't trying to enforce rules. She was trying to break him, but Karen had made one mistake. She assumed he'd play by the rules. She made up. Jackson reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened the HOA handbook PDF he had downloaded earlier. He hadn't read it. Yet, not really. But tonight, he would. And by the time he was done, he'd know it better than she did. By the time the 4th violation arrived, Jackson could recite the HOA's mailing address by heart. His trash can, his porch light wattage, the unapproved gravel perimeter where the excavator had backed in, all finable, all ridiculous, and all arriving in glossy white envelopes printed with the Ridgeview Estates logo. It became a daily ritual. Every afternoon around 3 o'clock, a fresh violation would flutter into his mailbox like a poisoned love letter. But it was more than paper now. Something darker had begun spreading in the neighborhood. Thighs from people who once waved. Shorter conversations. Sprinklers that conveniently turned on just as Jackson passed by on his morning walk. Ridgeview was no longer home, it was surveillance. One morning, he woke to the sound of steel on concrete. Contractor's equipment, 2 compact loaders, a utility trailer, and a stack of temporary fencing was gone. In its place was a single laminated sign. ZIP tied to the gate. Notice of stop work. Pending community arbitration decision. Do not proceed without board approval. It wasn't signed by the city. It was signed by Karen Delaney. Jackson stormed back into the house and called Edgar. The contractor picked up mid-sigh. "Sorry, man," Edgar muttered. "I got a call from some woman saying the HOA was filing injunctions. Even threatened to report me to the state license board if we kept going without HOA clearance." She sounded real prepared. "Doesn't have legal authority, Jackson." Growled. Edgar paused. "Yeah, well, I'm not risking my license on a technicality. Get it sorted and call me back." Weeds had already started to creep along the edges of the pit. The partially filled hole was now a stagnant pool of rainwater. Just enough to be useless, just enough to be damning. Later that week, he got the mosquito violation. Standing water. Poses a public health risk. $150. Jackson laughed out loud when he read that. One bidder. Humorless. That night, his doorbell rang just after sunset. He opened it cautiously to find no one there, only a flyer taped to the door. And what looked like a discoloration in the grass. A cross. The top, in all caps, "Is this safe for our children? Speak out before it's too late. RIDGEVIEW Protectors meeting Saturday at 7 p.m. Community Clubhouse's fists, tightened around the paper. Karen had turned his home into a public enemy, weaponized neighborly paranoia, and spun safety into suspicion. He couldn't believe how far she was willing to go. But the real punch came 2 days later. A manila envelope, larger than the others, arrived certified. Inside was a formal letter of escalation. Third notice of noncompliance. You are now subject to HOA litigation process review. You may be liable for full restoration of property to previous condition. Translation: fill the hole, rebuild the pool, and pay for the mess. She was trying to force him to spend tens of thousands fixing a problem. She created. Jackson sat in his study, papers spread across the desk, violations in piles like evidence. He opened the HOA handbook again and flipped to Article 12, where a footnote caught his eye. It referred to an obscure provision called the Restorative Landscape Clause. As he read, something clicked. If a structure predates a certain year-end, Jackson's pool, dated by almost a decade, could be removed without board approval, provided proper permits were filed. Which they were. He pulled up the contractor file and found everything stamped, signed, and city approved. He had them. Dead to rights. But then he flipped one more page and froze. Karen had built an extension to her backyard, a massive hot tub, covered by a pavilion, complete with lights and a stereo system. He remembered seeing it during a neighborhood barbecue 2 summers ago. He smiled for the first time in weeks, because nowhere in the HOA permits section was her addition listed. Karen Delaney was about to be hoisted on her own red tape petard. The next morning, Jackson awoke with a plan and a spark behind his eyes that hadn't been there in weeks. He poured a mug of coffee, set it beside the growing mountain of paperwork on his dining table. But as an investigator digging through the rot beneath the Ridgeview veneer, by noon, he had confirmed it. Karen Delaney's hot tub had no recorded approvals in the HOA modification registry. No request form, no inspection date, no permit. And under Ridgeview Estates Rule 9.4, any structural addition over 50 square feet required not only approval but also community review. Karen's spa palace is lead doubled that. Jackson grinned. The hypocrisy stung less now that he had leverage. He didn't stop there. He filed a formal request with the county for aerial property records and development permits. It cost him $27.50. But what it revealed was worth a fortune and satisfaction. Karen had installed the addition 4 years ago, right in the middle of her own campaign to crack down on unauthorized lawn decorations. Her fingerprints were all over. Memos lecturing residents about bird baths and porch swings. While she had quietly expanded her luxury backyard like a 5-star resort, he needed more. Witnesses, photos, documentation. He remembered the HOA annual barbecue 2 years ago. He texted Diane from across the street and casually brought it up. Within minutes, she replied with 3 pictures from that day. Karen lounging in the hot tub with a drink. He printed everything and organized it into a folder. The legal paperwork for his own pool removal, the restorative landscape clause, the drone photos of Karen's unpermitted spa extension, the barbecue snapshots. It was damning. But before he submitted anything, Jackson did something unexpected. He showed up to the next HOA meeting. The Ridgeview Estates monthly gathering was held in the clubhouse. A sterile beige room decorated with sad plastic ficus trees and folding chairs. The air smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Karen stood at the front, clipboard clutched like a weapon, calling the meeting to order. Next on the agenda, she said, glancing down at her notes, is the continuing noncompliance issue at 34 Ashcroft Lane regarding the unauthorized pool removal. A few murmurs rippled across the room. Mr. Blake, you may submit a written statement for board review. This portion is not open for resident comment. Jackson held up a manila envelope. Actually, I'm submitting a legal response. I've copied it to all board members. He walked forward and handed a folder to each of the 7 seated board members. Karen watched, her lips pressed so tight they disappeared. One of them, an older man named Stuart, flipped the folder open, adjusted his glasses, and frowned. This shows he had full permits. Another woman whispered, "And what's this about Article 12? Karen lunged. Irrelevant. He's a disturbance. Jackson, cut her off. Page 3, Section 6. You'll find unapproved modifications. To your own property, Karen, including installation dates, lack of permits, and photos from the community barbecue publicly posted by other residents. Want to talk about unapproved changes now?" The silence was explosive. Karen's voice cracked. "You're attacking me. This is harassment?" A third board member looked up. "Is it true you never filed for your spa enclosure?" Karen froze. Jackson looked around the room, voice level. "All I did was follow the rules," she weaponized. "The handbook to punish me for a decision on my own property. I didn't start this, but I promise you I will finish it." For the first time since this battle began, Karen didn't speak. She simply sat down, red creeping up her neck, the clipboard, resting useless in her lap. Karen didn't resign. She didn't apologize. She didn't even blink. What she did instead was retreat, quietly, strategically. For 3 days after the meeting, Ridgeview Estates settled into a strange, watchful silence. The mail was empty. The whispers stopped. No new violations appeared. Jackson hoped that maybe, just maybe, the truth had done its job. That perhaps exposure had burned through the fabric of HOA corruption like sunlight through fog. But Karen wasn't. A woman who surrendered. She regrouped. It started with the lights. One night around 2 a.m. Jackson woke up to what he thought was a power surge. His entire backyard was bathed in a sharp, artificial white glow. He stepped outside in his robe and slippers and froze. Someone had installed a massive industrial-grade floodlight on the adjacent property behind his fence, aimed directly into his yard, the kind you'd find at a construction site or prison yard. He shielded his eyes and looked for movement. The house behind his didn't usually have anyone awake past 10. But tonight, he saw a curtain flutter. He filed a complaint with the HOA the next morning. The receptionist, a young guy named Pete, seemed uncomfortable. "I'll log it," Pete said, "but Mrs. Delaney handles property disputes." "Of course she does," Jackson muttered. "Tell her to aim her spotlight at someone else's house, or I'll file a nuisance complaint with the city." He hung up and looked out at the floodlit yard. No longer quiet. No longer private. Just a pool-sized pit glowing under interrogation. That evening, a handwritten note appeared on his front door stuffed into a clear plastic sleeve. "Maybe next time, try being a neighbor, not a lawyer. Ridgeview deserves better." No name. Just spite. The next week was worse. Jackson returned home one afternoon to find a city inspector standing in his driveway, clipboard in hand. "You, Mr. Blake." "Yeah, something wrong?" "We've had a report of unlicensed excavation and improper sediment containment. Need to do a quick site check." Jackson clenched his jaw. "Who reported it?" The inspector just shrugged. It took nearly 2 hours of paperwork and back and forth. But in the end, the inspector found nothing wrong. Jackson had his permits. His drainage was in order. His paperwork was airtight. The city left, mildly annoyed, but unconcerned. But Jackson wasn't. He knew exactly who had filed the complaint. That night, he called his attorney. Harassment. The lawyer repeated, "It's close. But unless she physically threatens you or causes actual damage, it's hard to pin down." HOAs are tricky. Jackson exhaled. "She's using other people to do her dirty work. You need to catch her in the act." Jackson hung up, walked into the garage, and stared at the dusty box labeled Wisecam Security. Kit. He hadn't used the cameras since his kids were in high school. But tonight they were going back up by midnight for discreet. Motion-activated cameras were watching every angle of his property too, in the backyard. One over the driveway and one facing the alley. He wired them to his phone, set up alerts, and waited. 2 nights later, he got a ping. Motion detected backyard gate 1:43 a.m. He opened the video feed. The grainy black and white footage showed a hooded figure slipping through the alley. Gate, ducking low. They moved to the edge of the pit and appeared to pour something into it from a plastic container. The person didn't stay long. Timestamped it and uploaded it to a private folder titled HOA Harassment Evidence. Karen thought she could stalk him in shadows, that no one would dare challenge her throne, that no camera would catch the queen breaking her own laws. But Jackson had her now, and he was done playing defense. Jackson didn't waste a second. The moment he had the footage of Karen pouring something into his backyard pit, he emailed it to his attorney with a brief message. Subject, evidence of trespassing and possible environmental violation. Urgent, Karen. Delaney caught on video. At 1:43 a.m., entering private property and pouring unknown substance into excavation site. See attached footage. By morning, he had a reply. Proceeding with formal notice. Suggest reporting to both HOA board and environmental authority. This just turned from harassment into a potential health code violation. Jackson felt a grim. Satisfaction pulsed through him. He had the upper hand now. This wasn't just HOA territory anymore. This was criminal. He printed out screenshots from the footage, highlighted the timestamps, and drafted a letter with the help of his attorney, citing HOA bylaw breaches, trespassing statutes, and possible environmental contamination under the local county code. Then he packaged the entire thing into neat folders, again for each board member. But this time, he didn't wait for a meeting. He showed up at the HOA clubhouse during business hours and personally handed the materials to Pete at the front desk. The poor guy blinked at the contents, then at Jackson, then back again. "Ah, this is serious," Pete muttered. Jackson nodded. "And if the board doesn't take action, the county will." An hour later, a board member named Stewart, one of the few who hadn't completely rolled over for Karen, called him. "I saw the footage," Stewart said. "This is bad. Real bad. You sure you want to go public with this?" "I didn't pour anything into anyone's yard at 2 a.m., Jackson replied. "She did," Stewart exhaled. "We'll have an emergency board session tomorrow. No residents, just internal. I'll make sure it's addressed." That night, Jackson got another motion alert on his phone. Same time window, same backyard. Angle. But this time, it wasn't Karen. It was two men in jeans and Ridgeview security windbreakers, walking the alley near his gate, pointing toward his camera. One of them held a clipboard. The other held what looked like a ladder. Jackson watched as they stopped directly beneath his side fence and gestured upward right where his cam was hidden in the gutter line. They were looking for it. He didn't go out. He didn't stop them. Instead, he hit record on the live feed. 2 minutes later, one of them climbed the fence slightly, just enough to get a photo of the cam. Not touch it, but enough to see it. The next morning, he got a notice in the mail. Violation notice, unauthorized surveillance. Device on exterior structure. Ridgeview HOA does not permit unapproved camera installations facing shared or public access areas. Please remove immediately. The audacity almost made him laugh. They didn't want to stop Karen. They wanted to shut him up. But it was too late for that now. Jackson scanned the violation, emailed it to his attorney again, and then made his next move. He uploaded the entire video occurrence trespassing, the floodlight harassment, and the new footage of Ridgeview agents snooping around to a private YouTube link titled "What the HOA Doesn't Want You to See Ridgeview Estate Abuse," and sent it to 3 local news stations. He didn't want attention. He didn't want drama. He wanted leverage. And that's exactly what landed on Karen's doorstep the next afternoon. In the form of a knock-out to county officials, one in a green environmental services jacket, the other in a brown code enforcement uniform, stood on her porch, clipboards in hand. As the neighborhood watched from behind half-open blinds, Karen tried to smile. But Jackson, sitting on his porch with a cold drink and a front row view, knew better. Because this time, the one being investigated wasn't him. Karen's world began to fracture the moment the county officials stepped onto her porch from across the street. Jackson watched as she tried to perform her usual charm, routine-wide smiles. Over-explanations, hand gestures that danced like she was conducting a parade. But the officials weren't neighbors. They weren't board members. And they definitely weren't impressed. One of them held up a tablet and pointed to a paused video framed the exact moment Karen poured liquid into Jackson's excavation pit. Her expression faltered for just a second. That second was all Jackson needed to see. The Queen of Ridgeview was finally cornered. Over the next few days, things unraveled faster than anyone expected. First came the notice of investigation taped to Karen's door by county authorities. Not subtle, not private. It sat fluttering in the breeze for hours before Karen finally yanked it down. But by then, everyone in the neighborhood had seen it. Few even took photos. Then, the anonymous flyer campaign that Karen had launched weeks earlier, claiming Jackson's pool was unsafe and threatening children, came full circle. A pair of board members admitted behind closed doors that Karen had printed and distributed them herself without approval. The board began to distance themselves publicly. Stewart, now the acting vice chair, issued a formal message to residents. Ridgeview. HOA is committed to ethical enforcement of community standards. We are reviewing all board actions for fairness and compliance. Residents' rights must be protected. The phrase residents' rights hadn't appeared in any HOA newsletter in over a decade. By the end of the week, Karen had stopped showing up to meetings. The once feared woman who patrolled sidewalks with a notepad and smug grin had become a ghost. In her own kingdom, her calls to neighbors were left unanswered. Her attempts to hold a surprise community inspection walk drew exactly 0 participants. Jackson, meanwhile, got a call he didn't expect from Pete, the receptionist. Mr. Blake. Just wanted to let you know, the board voted this morning. The violation notices against your property have been dismissed, retroactively voided. All of them, Jackson asked. Every single one, including the environmental nuisance complaint and Karen. Pete paused, voice quieter. They're asking her to resign. Officially, it'll be a leave of absence. But between you and me, her credibility's gone. Jackson didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he walked into his backyard, the pit now dry and cleaned. Waiting for regrading, Anne took a long breath. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel like a battleground. But it wasn't over yet, too. Days later, Jackson received a hand-delivered letter. No HOA seal, no county logo. Just a plain white envelope with his name printed in blocky handwriting. Inside was a short, scrawled message. You think this makes you a hero? You've poisoned this neighborhood? You'll regret this when you're silenced? Was all I asked for? Kay Jackson stared at the note. Not a threat, not quite. Karen, what a promise that Karen wasn't done. Still, this time, he didn't panic. He simply took a photo, scanned the original, and added it to the folder labeled HOA documentation. He knew Karen, knew she was prideful. Dangerous when cornered and incapable of walking away from a fight she didn't win. But Jackson wasn't the same man she had bullied in silence. He had the law, the cameras, and most of all, the truth. Karen might still have venom, but her crown was gone. And now he had the throne. For a week, Ridgeview Estates simmered in an uneasy calm. Karen's resignation, though labeled a leave of absence, was the talk of every porch and mailbox. Residents no longer whispered behind curtains. They openly discussed her downfall in driveway huddles and group chats. A few even approached Jackson, offering thanks, apologies, and in one case, a fresh pie for standing up to that woman. Still, Jackson remained wary. He knew Karen well enough by now. Silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. So when a black SUV pulled into his driveway one evening, he was already recording from his porch cam. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a leather briefcase and an envelope. Mr. Blake, the man asked, approaching with a professional, polite nod. Depends who's asking. I represent Mrs. Karen Delaney. She's pursuing formal civil action. Defamation, emotional distress, character assassination. Jackson stared. Trespassed, harassed, and poisoned my backyard. And she thinks she's the victim. The man didn't flinch. My job isn't to argue. It's to deliver this. He handed over the envelope and left without another word. Inside were 6 printed pages filled with legalese, half-hearted threats, and a demand for Jackson to cease public sharing of malicious or slanderous materials, targeting Mrs. Delaney's reputation. He almost laughed instead. Jackson called his attorney. This is what we expected, she said calmly. She's trying to claw back power by using intimidation disguised as litigation. But your evidence is solid. Let's answer her bluff with something better: motion to dismiss, counterclaim for harassment, and official request for HOA audit records. That last part caught Jackson's attention. Audit. Absolutely, the attorney replied. Let's see just how many rules she's bent over the years. She wants to play in court, we bring the whole kingdom with us. It's the paperwork. Went out the next morning. What came back, though? Wasn't just a legal reply, was a leak. An anonymous package showed up in Jackson's mailbox. No return address. Just a flash drive inside a padded envelope labeled, "You should know what." She did before you moved in. Jackson loaded the contents onto his laptop. Inside were over 30 PDF files, internal HOA memos, edited inspection reports, and meeting minutes. Some never released to residents. There were emails between Karen and former board members, pressuring them to cite specific families for infractions while ignoring others. Several of those families had mysteriously moved within months, and in the oldest folder, document titled Violation Forgiveness, Delaney Clause. It was a loophole Karen had inserted herself. A quiet amendment stating the board chair could retroactively approve minor structural changes without a vote so long as it was for aesthetic cohesion. She had used it to legalize her own spa, deck, and an outdoor kitchen. Without ever submitting forms, Jackson's blood ran cold. This wasn't just HOA overreach, was corruption. He packaged everything, forwarded it to his lawyer, the HOA board. And once again the same 3 news stations that had ignored the first round. This time, they responded. 2 days later, Ridgeview Estates made local headlines. HOA power abuse scandal. Board president resigns amid allegations of fraud, retaliation, and tampering. Karen's face, once a symbol of control, was now attached to terms like investigation, possible embezzlement, and criminal review pending. Stewart took over as interim president, promising transparency and resident-led reform. At the next open HOA meeting, Jackson didn't speak. He didn't need to. The board formally apologized for mishandling his pool case. His removal was approved retroactively and unanimously. The audience clapped. A few neighbors even stood. But Jackson didn't smile until Stewart looked up and asked the final question of the night. Mr. Blake, is there anything you'd like to add? Jackson rose, cleared his throat, and said one thing. Let this be the last time Ridgeview punishes the ones who follow the rules and protects the ones who break them. Then he sat down. Justice had been served. The pool was gone. The throne was empty, and the era of Karen officially drained.